I was standing in my aunt's kitchen, balancing a paper plate full of mashed potatoes and ham, when I heard my cousin say, "Your parents threw a beautiful Christmas party last night." The words hit harder than the cold Oregon air outside. I blinked at her thinking I'd misheard. My parents. A party. Without me. She laughed, showing me a photo on her phone, my mother in her red sweater smiling beside the tree I had bought last year. My chest tightened. I felt the fork slip from my hand and clatter against the plate. For a moment, everything around me, the laughter, the clinking cups, the smell of cinnamon, went distant. I'd driven 6 hours from San Diego to surprise them, only to find out the surprise was mine. They had celebrated without me. And what I overheard that night would unravel every illusion I still had about family love and loyalty. The room buzzed with chatter and the faint echo of a Christmas playlist. My aunt's house smelled like nutmeg and pine, and I could hear kids chasing each other down the hallway, their laughter spilling into every corner. I forced a smile and moved toward the kitchen island, pretending to fix my plate. My cousin Emily scrolled through her phone again, oblivious to the way my stomach had dropped. "It was so nice," she went on. "Your mom said you were probably too busy with work to come up from San Diego. Oh, and that roast, wow, your dad looked so proud." My jaw ached from clenching. Too busy. That was her excuse. The one she fed everyone else, so she wouldn't have to admit I hadn't even been invited. I felt my chest tighten as I set the plate down on the counter. Emily looked up at me, her eyes bright with holiday cheer, still unaware she'd said something that had just broken me in half. "You didn't see the pictures?" she asked. I shook my head, quickly grabbed a napkin, and muttered something about needing to find my aunt. In the hallway, the noise dulled. The smell of roast ham and gingerbread still clung to the air, but it all felt far away, like I was walking through someone else's house. My hands shook as I dug my phone out of my purse. No missed calls, no texts, nothing that even hinted at a Christmas party. My reflection stared back from the black screen, tired eyes, a forced smile that didn't belong to me. I whispered under my breath, "They just forgot." But I knew they hadn't. My mom didn't forget things. She planned them, polished them, made them look perfect. This wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. Through the dining room window, I could see my parents' Christmas card pinned to the corkboard. I recognized the photo, one I'd taken for them last December before leaving for a late-night shift. They were smiling in front of the same tree I had paid for, wrapped in the same lights I had ordered. A quiet laugh slipped from my throat, brittle and small. I had built that image, and now I wasn't even part of it. I stepped outside, pretending to take a phone call. The air hit me like a slap. The yard was glowing with white lights, and the neighbor's inflatable Santa waved from across the fence. I pulled my coat tighter and tried to breathe, but the air was too sharp. My car was parked down the street, already dusted with frost. The thought of getting in, turning the heater on, and driving away tempted me, but my legs felt heavy. I leaned against the railing and looked up at the night sky. The stars were faint, hidden behind clouds, but I could still see the glow from downtown Portland in the distance. "Too busy," I whispered again, tasting the bitterness of the words. I thought about last year, how I'd wrapped all the gifts myself, how I'd stayed up until 2 in the morning helping Mom decorate because she said her back hurt. I remembered standing in that same living room, handing Sophie her new laptop bought with my bonus from work. "You're always so good to us, sweetheart," Mom had said, brushing my hair back. "You make it all look easy." Back then, I thought she meant it. I went back inside long enough to grab my bag. Emily called out something about taking a family photo, but I waved her off, muttering that I had an early drive. My aunt smiled and hugged me goodbye, unaware that my insides felt like they were breaking apart. "Drive safe, honey," she said. Her warmth stung. I nodded and stepped back into the cold. In the car, I sat for a long moment before turning the key. The steering wheel was freezing under my fingers. The radio flickered on "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas." I turned it off instantly. My throat tightened. I could still hear Emily's words looping in my mind. "Your mom said you were probably too busy." That was how she erased me, gently, politely, with a smile. The drive to my Airbnb was silent except for the hum of the tires on wet pavement. Every house I passed glowed with colored lights and silhouettes of families gathered around tables. Each one looked like a world I no longer belonged to. My eyes blurred, and for a moment I couldn't tell if it was the snow or the tears. I pulled into the driveway, shut off the engine, and sat there breathing shallowly. Inside, the rentals smelled faintly of vanilla candles and old wood. I hung my coat by the door and sank onto the edge of the bed, staring at the tiny Christmas tree on the dresser. It looked sad, plastic branches bent awkwardly, its lights blinking in uneven rhythm. I thought of Mom's perfect tree, every ornament chosen carefully, every light balanced. I thought of how I'd spent years sending money to make sure their holidays looked like that, the mortgage payment, the electric bill, Sophie's college fund. I reached for my phone again, thumb hovering over Mom's name. What would I even say? That I'd found out by accident, that I was humiliated, that I had spent most of my adult life taking care of people who could erase me so easily. The questions burned, but the answers scared me more. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the snow was falling again, soft and steady. The streetlights turned it gold. Somewhere a dog barked and a neighbor laughed. The world kept moving even when my own had stopped. I pressed my palm to the glass and felt the cold seep into my skin. My breath fogged the window, blurring the lights beyond. Maybe Mom was right, I thought. Maybe I really was too busy. Too busy working, too busy paying, too busy being the reliable one. Maybe they'd grown used to the idea that I'd always be there, no invitation required. But tonight had changed that. My phone buzzed again, a notification from Instagram. Sophie had posted a photo, the entire family, smiling in front of the fireplace, their matching red sweaters glowing under the lights. The caption read, "Family Christmas." I stared at it until the screen went black. The ache inside me sharpened into something colder, harder, more certain. My hands stopped trembling. My breathing steadied. I whispered, "Tomorrow I'll call her. And this time I won't stay quiet." The next morning, the gray light seeped through the blinds, pale and cold against the Airbnb walls. I sat on the bed, wrapped in a blanket, the same photo still open on my phone. My family smiling by the fire, matching red sweaters, the caption reading "Family Christmas." My throat tightened every time I looked at it, but I couldn't stop. I pressed the back of my hand to my mouth and whispered, "Just call her Rachel." I stared at the phone for a long time before finally pressing the green button. My mother picked up after only 2 rings. "Hi, honey," she said brightly, like nothing in the world was wrong. "Merry Christmas. How are you?" Her voice was smooth, practiced, the kind she used with acquaintances at church. "Did you have a Christmas party last night?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. There was a pause, a small click of the refrigerator closing in the background. "Well, yes, dear. Why do you ask? Because I wasn't invited." A light laugh floated through the line, the kind meant to brush things away. "Oh, Rachel, don't make this a big deal. You're always so busy with work. I didn't want to pressure you." The words came slow, heavy. I could feel the blood drain from my face. "Too busy, yes, sweetheart," she said, almost sighing. "You work so hard, always traveling, always tired. We thought it would be easier this way." Easier. That word again. Like I was a scheduling issue, not her daughter. "You could have told me," I said quietly. "You know how the holidays get," she continued, her tone clipped and cheerful. "Everything came together so fast. We just kept it small. A few neighbors, Carol, Sophie's friends. Nothing formal." I swallowed hard. Right. Nothing formal. There was silence, the faint hum of her kitchen in the background. Then she said, "You're not upset, are you?" I looked at the wall, the paint chipped near the window. "I don't even know what I am," I said. "Well, don't be dramatic," she replied softly. "You'll see us soon, won't you? We'll make it up to you." That word dramatic hit like a slap. She'd used it when I cried at Dad's funeral, when I called her, after losing my job, when I told her I was lonely in a city where no one knew me. It had always been her way of shutting me down. I hung up before she could say anything else. My hand shook as I set the phone down on the table. The fake Christmas tree blinked in the corner, casting small dots of red and green across the room. The silence buzzed in my ears. After a while, I called again. Maybe she would hear me differently the second time. This time, she answered with the same bright tone. "Hi, honey. Everything all right? Why did I have to find out from Emily that you had a party?" I asked. "You could have told me yourself." Her laugh was light, rehearsed. "Oh, Rachel, it was nothing big, just a little gathering. We knew you'd be busy, and I didn't want to make you feel pressured." There it was again. Busy. Pressured. Convenient excuses wrapped in affection. I clenched my jaw. "I'm your daughter, not a client you're trying to schedule." She sighed sharp this time. "Don't be dramatic," she repeated. "We thought it would be easier for everyone." Easier for everyone but me, I wanted to say. Instead, I pressed my palm into the counter and asked, "Can I talk to Dad?" The phone shuffled a low hum, then his voice quiet, distracted. "Hey, kiddo. How are you holding up? Did you know about the party?" He hesitated, then said, "Yeah, of course. Your mom thought it might be best to keep it small this year." Small meaning without me. "Don't take it that way," he said quickly. "We just figured you'd be tired from work, maybe not want to drive in the snow." "It's not about the snow," I said. "It's about not being wanted." He went quiet, then cleared his throat. "We're sorry if your feelings were hurt. If." That single syllable carried a lifetime of dismissal. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "Thanks for being honest," I said, and hung up. I stood there for a long time, hands trembling. The heater clicked on, filling the silence with a low hum. My reflection in the window looked pale, unfamiliar. I whispered, "Easier, huh?" After a while, I opened my laptop and pulled up my bank account. The numbers stared back at me: monthly, transfers, automatic payments, the unending list of ways I'd been keeping their life stable. Mortgage, utilities, Sophie's tuition. I scrolled until my vision blurred. I thought of the holidays where I'd sent money for gifts I never saw, vacations I wasn't invited to. I'd called it love. They'd called it convenience. The phone buzzed again. Sophie. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but I answered. "Hey," she said cheerfully. "Merry Christmas. Sorry, I forgot to tell you about the party. It was kind of last minute." "You forgot?" She laughed. "Yeah, Mom said you were probably too busy anyway. You work crazy hours, right? Plus, driving up here in the snow, ugh, nightmare." I bit the inside of my cheek. Right, the snow. "But it was fun. Mom made her cranberry pie. Dad grilled the roast. Everyone asked about you." "Did anyone ask why I wasn't there?" I asked. A pause. Not really. They just assumed you had work. You always do." I almost laughed, but it came out as a small sound between a sigh and a sob. "I always do." Sophie kept talking, oblivious. "Oh, and thanks for covering my tuition again. I swear I'll pay you back once I get a job." I closed my eyes. "Don't worry about it," I said flatly. "You're the best," she said, her voice light and young. "Seriously, Rach, what would we do without you?" I hung up before she could finish. The silence after the call felt heavier than before. I walked to the window. Outside, snow drifted softly across the streetlights. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass and let out a slow breath. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was smaller and sharper, a quiet sting that lived behind my ribs. For years, I'd been the one who answered every call, fixed every crisis, sent every check. I'd thought that made me good. It just made me useful. The room felt too still, so I moved. I opened my notebook from my bag, the one I used for budgeting, and flipped to a clean page. Across the top, I wrote the date, December 26. Then I made a list. Mortgage, $2, $100 per month. Utilities, gas, electric, water, Mom's prescriptions, automatic payment, Sophie's tuition, spring semester due soon. I stared at the lines until the ink blurred. 4 lines that summed up 7 years of my life. 7 years of working late, of sending money before paying my own rent, of believing that family meant sacrifice. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. I pressed the pen to the paper and added one last word beneath the list. Why? Why did I do it? Why did I keep saying yes? The heater clicked off. The silence returned, pressing against the walls. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. The clock on the stove blinked 12:17. I poured a glass of water, drank it, then set it down with a small thud. My pulse was steady now. If I stopped giving, I whispered, would they even notice I was gone? The words hung in the air like frost. I walked back to the table, opened the notebook again, and drew a line beneath the list. Beneath it, I wrote in smaller letters, to be reviewed. The pen dug into the paper, leaving small dents beneath the ink. I stared at the page until the words blurred again, then closed the notebook and slid it into my bag. The snow outside kept falling steady and soundless. I turned off the light, crawled under the blanket, and let the darkness settle around me. I wasn't ready to decide anything yet, but deep down I already knew what would come next. The next morning I woke to the sound of snowplows scraping the street outside. The sky was the color of tin and everything felt numb quiet. The clock on the nightstand said 8:30, but I stayed still under the blanket listening to the hum of the heater. I'd barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's smile, heard her laugh through the phone, and the word easier echoing like a rattle in my head. When I finally sat up, my body felt heavy, like the air itself had weight. The small Airbnb kitchen smelled faintly of stale coffee from the night before. I made a new pot, poured a cup, and sat at the table staring at the steam curling in front of me. I should have called them back. I should have demanded an explanation. But I already knew what she'd say, something tidy, something polite. "You're overreacting, sweetheart. Don't be dramatic." The phrase had become her signature. I pulled the black notebook from my bag and laid it flat on the table. My hands hesitated before opening it. Inside, the first few pages were filled with lists and reminders, rent, due dates, deadlines from work notes, from client meetings. Ordinary life, tidy and predictable. Then I turned to a blank page. The silence in the room stretched, pressing at my chest. I wrote across the top in slow, deliberate strokes what I pay for. The first line came easily. Mortgage, $2,100 divided by month since 2017. The second followed without pause. Utilities, gas, electricity, water. Then Mom's prescriptions. And finally Sophie's tuition. I sat back and looked at the words. 4 simple lines. They looked harmless, almost innocent in ink, but each one was a piece of my life I'd handed over without question. I thought about the late nights at the office, balancing client accounts while balancing theirs too. The times I'd skipped vacations, skipped rest, to make sure the house payment cleared. Every number had a story behind it. Every dollar had a piece of me attached. My chest tightened as I added one more note beside the mortgage entry, autopay my account. I'd set that up 8 years ago after Dad's early retirement. I remembered the conversation clearly. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table staring at the bills spread in front of him like a battlefield. Mom had said, "It'll just be for a few months until we adjust." I'd believed her. "You're part of this house too," she'd said, her voice soft, proud. Back then I thought she meant love. Now I realized she'd meant liability. I traced my finger down the page, rereading the list until the letters blurred. Then I closed the notebook and pushed it away. My coffee had gone cold. I stood up and moved to the window, watching the street below. Snow still drifted lazily through the air, melting as it touched the asphalt. A man across the street was scraping ice from his windshield. Everything looked normal, ordinary. My world had cracked and no one else even noticed. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, whispering, "They didn't forget me. They just decided life was easier without me." A knock at the door startled me. When I opened it, the Airbnb host was standing there holding a small paper bag. "Leftover muffins," she said kindly. "Too many for me." I thanked her, took the bag, and closed the door. The smell of cinnamon filled the kitchen. I hadn't realized how hungry I was. I tore one open and ate it slowly, each bite grounding me a little more in the moment. After breakfast, I sat back down and reopened the notebook. My handwriting stared back like proof of a crime. I flipped to another page and wrote one more line smaller this time. If I stopped, what would happen? The question lingered. I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. By late morning, I decided to go outside. The cold slapped my face as soon as I stepped onto the porch. The street was quiet, lined with cars dusted in snow, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. I walked aimlessly, hands deep in my pockets, boots crunching against the ice. There was a cafe at the corner, its windows fogged with warmth. I went inside. The air smelled of espresso and sugar. People sat in pairs, bundled in scarves, chatting softly. The sound of spoons clinking against mugs filled the space. I ordered a black coffee and found a small table by the window. The barista handed me a ceramic cup, its rim chipped on one side. I cupped it in both hands, letting the heat sink into my skin. For a moment, I let myself imagine my parents sitting across from me, just talking, no tension, no ledger of favors and debts between us. Then I remembered the truth: we hadn't had a real conversation in years. Everything we said to each other came wrapped in guilt and expectation. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. Rows of transactions filled the screen: mortgage, utilities, pharmacy, tuition, each one a timestamp of my quiet servitude. I scrolled back months, then years. The pattern didn't change. Same amounts, same rhythm. Reliable as clockwork. I closed the app and stared out the window. A family passed by on the sidewalk, laughing, the father pulling a child on a sled while the mother filmed on her phone. Their voices were muffled through the glass, but their joy was clear. I wanted to be happy for them, but all I felt was a hollow ache. I left a few dollars on the table and stepped back into the cold. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Julia, my closest friend back in San Diego. "You okay? Haven't heard from you." I stared at the message for a long time before replying, "Not really, something happened." A few minutes later, my phone rang. Julia's voice came through, full of concern. "Talk to me." I told her everything. About the party, the phone call, the years of silent giving. My words spilled out, messy but unstoppable. Julia didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a long pause on her end. "Rachel," she said finally, "that's not love, that's dependence. They made you their safety net." "I can't just cut them off," I said, my voice cracking. "They'd fall apart." "Maybe they need to," she said quietly. "You've been carrying them for so long they forgot how to stand." I leaned against a lamppost, closing my eyes. The wind stung my cheeks. "It feels cruel." "It's not cruel," she said. "It's honest. Silence isn't punishment, it's a boundary." Her words sank deep, heavier than I expected. For years, I'd equated silence with rejection. But maybe it could be something else. When we hung up, I stood there for a while, staring at the falling snow. Each flake landed softly, dissolving into the pavement, gone, before anyone could notice it existed. I knew the feeling. Back at the Airbnb, the room felt smaller than before. I took out the notebook again and stared at the page where I'd written the list. My pen hovered above it, then I drew a single deliberate line through each entry. When I reached the bottom, I wrote one word in all caps: stop. I set the pen down. My hands trembled, but my chest felt lighter. The heater kicked on, filling the silence with steady warmth. I leaned back in the chair and let out a long breath. I wasn't sure what came next. But for the first time in years, the next step would be mine to choose. Outside, the snow had turned to rain, thin silver lines streaking down the glass. I made a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched it fall. My phone buzzed again, another text from Mom unread. I turned it face down on the table and whispered, "Not tonight." The notebook lay open beside me, the ink still drying. I traced the word "stop" with my fingertip and smiled faintly. Maybe silence wasn't absence. Maybe it was the beginning of being heard. I woke before sunrise, the air inside the Airbnb dry and still. The world outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that happens after a storm, heavy waiting. A pale glow crept through the blinds, painting thin lines across the wall. The black notebook sat on the table, open to the page I'd marked the night before. The word stop stared back at me in dark, sharp ink. For a long time I just looked at it. My hand hovered above the page, the same way it used to hover above a bank transfer button. Then, almost without thinking, I reached for my laptop. My reflection in the screen looked calm, almost foreign. I logged into my bank account and found the familiar autopay list that had ruled my life for years. Mortgage, utilities, Sophie's tuition. Each one linked automatic constant. I clicked cancel on the first, delete on the second, pause on the third. My finger hesitated for a second before hitting confirm. Then it was done. 3 clicks. That was all it took to undo years of quiet sacrifice. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was steady, clean. I sat back in the chair waiting for panic to come, but it didn't. My breathing evened out. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee from the pot I'd forgotten to turn off. I whispered, "There. Now they'll see what busy really means." Outside, the snow had turned to a light drizzle. The sound of melting ice tapped gently against the window. I made a fresh cup of coffee and stood watching it fall. Every drop that slid down the glass felt like something being washed away, guilt-duty exhaustion. I took a deep breath and let it out slow. For years I had believed love was measured by what I could give. Every wire transfer, every loan, every quiet yes had been a currency for belonging. But now, standing there with an empty to-do list, I realized I had mistaken service for connection. Love without respect wasn't love at all, it was debt. The thought made me laugh softly, almost bitterly. I grabbed my coat and car keys and decided to drive into town. The sky was gray, the roads wet, but the day felt lighter than any I'd had in months. The thrift shop on the corner had a handwritten sign, taped to the window, "Post-holiday sale, 70% off inside." The air smelled like dust and old fabric softener. I wandered through aisles of forgotten decorations and chipped mugs. A small ceramic cup caught my eye, white with fading blue letters that read, "My house, my rules." I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. A tiny crack ran along the handle. I smiled. It felt perfect. At the counter, the cashier wrapped it in brown paper. $1.50, she said. As I handed her the cash, something warm flickered in my chest. It wasn't joy exactly, more like a pulse of self-recognition. I left the store with the cup tucked safely in my coat pocket. On the way back, I stopped at a candle shop. A cedarwood one caught my attention. Its label read Restoration. The scent was earthy, grounding, like something meant to remind you who you were before everything went wrong. I bought it and drove home with the candle burning in the cup holder, its flame steady in the dim car. Back at the Airbnb, I lit the candle on the kitchen table and sat beside it, watching the wax melt into a small pool of gold. The soft glow reflected against the window, and for the first time I didn't feel small in the silence. I felt powerful. My phone buzzed on the table. A message from Mom's sweetheart, the mortgage company, called. Did something happen with the payment? I stared at the screen, heart calm. 10 minutes later, another one came. Maybe the bank made an error. Check when you can. I turned the phone face down. The candle flickered, the flame bending slightly before standing tall again. For years I'd answered every call, jumped at every crisis. Their emergencies were my reflex. But now I realized I didn't owe them my reaction. My silence was my answer. I took the new mug out of the paper bag and poured myself coffee. The words, "My house, my rules," faced me as I lifted it. I whispered the phrase under my breath, tasting each word like freedom. In the afternoon, the rain picked up again. I curled up on the couch, candle burning beside me, and closed my eyes. My mind drifted to the past late nights, frantic phone calls, my mother's careful tone when asking for help. "It's just this," once she'd say. Then, just one more time. I could still hear her voice from the night before. "We thought it would be easier this way." The memory stung, but this time it didn't paralyze me. It clarified things. Easier had always meant cheaper. I was the hidden discount on their comfort. When the phone buzzed again, I didn't reach for it. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote across a blank page, This is not punishment. It's balance. I underlined the last word twice. Later that day, Julia called. Her name lit up the screen and I answered. "You sound different," she said after a moment. "I did it," I told her. "I stopped everything." There was a small pause. Then her voice softened. "Good. How do you feel?" Strangely calm. I looked at the candle, like I'm finally breathing my own air. Julia chuckled. "You've been suffocating in everyone else's for years. Enjoy the oxygen." I laughed quietly, though a trace of fear still lingered under my ribs. "Do you think I'm being cruel?" "No," she said. "Cruel is pretending everything's fine. You're just being honest." Her words settled over me like a warm blanket. "Silence isn't cruel," she added. "It's the only language some people ever listen to." That line stayed with me long after we hung up. By evening, the clouds had darkened, the rain turned heavier. I sat at the window watching drops streak down the glass. The phone buzzed again, Mom this time, then Dad. I ignored both. The longer I stayed quiet, the louder their panic would become, but that wasn't my problem anymore. In the past, I'd called back instantly, heart pounding, afraid of disappointing them. Now I just watched the screen light up and fade, light up and fade. I took a sip from my mug, its warmth anchoring me in the moment. The candle's scent filled the room, cedar and smoke, the smell of something rebuilt. I wrote in my notebook again. They used silence to erase me. I'll use it to find myself. As I finished the sentence, a tremor of emotion ran through me. Not sadness, not anger, but something steadier. A quiet kind of power. Around midnight, I turned off the lights and let the candle burn low. The air was thick with its scent. For a moment, guilt crept back in, whispering, "What ifs? What if they couldn't handle the fallout? What if this destroyed everything?" Then I remembered her words. "It'll be easier this way." I smiled faintly in the dark. "Then let it be easy," I whispered. The heater clicked on, filling the quiet with warmth. The flame flickered once more before I blew it out. The smoke curled upward, soft and slow, disappearing into the dark. When I woke the next morning, my phone was silent. The air was still heavy with the faint trace of cedar. I poured coffee into my mug and sat by the window. The world outside was washed clean, the sky pale blue sunlight glinting off wet pavement. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I owed anyone anything. I lifted the mug to my lips, smiled, and said softly, "My house. My rules." The first call came before sunrise. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the sound slicing through the quiet. I didn't even need to look at the screen to know who it was. Mom. I let it ring until it stopped, then turned over and stared at the ceiling. A moment later, it started again. By the time I finally picked up the phone, there were already 5 missed calls and 3 texts. The first one said, "Honey, the bank called. The mortgage payment didn't go through. Maybe there's a glitch." The next one was shorter. "Please check okay. They might charge late fees." The third said nothing at all, just a photo of the letter the bank had mailed, the red stamp visible, even through the blur. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and took a deep breath. The air in the room was warm, still scented faintly of last night's candle. For years, their emergencies had pulled me out of sleep like alarms. This morning, I let the silence stay. When I got up, the snow outside had melted into gray slush. I made breakfast toast, scrambled eggs, and forced myself to eat slowly even as the phone started buzzing again. Another text, then another. I didn't look. I moved through the morning like I was walking underwater, slow but deliberate. By the time I sat down with my coffee, the screen showed 12 missed calls. My stomach tightened, but not from guilt. It was habit, the old reflex of wanting to fix things. I remembered all the times before, Mom calling about the electric bill, Dad, about the car insurance, Sophie crying about her tuition. "You're so good at handling these things," they'd say, and I would feel both proud and exhausted. Now I realized what they really meant. "You're the one who keeps us from falling apart." I sipped my coffee and whispered, "Then fall." Around noon, I finally looked at the phone. 23 missed calls, 4 voicemails. I played one just to see. Rachel, sweetheart, Mom's voice began sharp but trembling. The mortgage company called again. They said a late notice will be mailed. Please call me back. This is serious. The next one was Dad. Hey kiddo. Not sure what's happening, but your mom's upset. Can you just handle this? It'll be easier for everyone. The third was Sophie, her voice high and frantic. Rach, my school emailed me. Something about delayed payment, can you fix it? I pressed delete after each one. My heart didn't even race this time. They didn't ask how I was. They didn't ask if I was okay. They only asked if I could fix it. That was the version of me they knew, the fixer, the quiet guarantee. I slipped on my coat and stepped outside. The cold bit at my face, but the air felt cleaner than inside. I walked down the street to the bakery on the corner, the same one I'd passed every day, but never gone into. The bell over the door chimed softly as I entered. The warmth hit me like a wave, coffee, sugar, cinnamon. The woman behind the counter smiled. Cold day for a walk, she said. Needed the air, I replied. She poured me a cup of coffee and handed it over without asking what I wanted in it. First one's on the house, she said with a wink. You look like you need it. I laughed quietly and thanked her. I found a seat by the window, the mug warm between my palms. Outside the sky was low and heavy, but the world kept moving. Cars passed, people walked their dogs. No one knew that my family was unraveling a few hundred miles away. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket again. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I looked out the window and thought about what Julia had said. Silence isn't cruel. It's the only language some people ever listen to. The guilt still tugged at the edges of my peace, whispering what ifs. What if they couldn't handle it? What if the house really was at risk? But I reminded myself of the truth. They hadn't been handling it for years. I had. I stayed in the bakery until the sky started to darken. When I got home, I made soup and lit another candle. The phone was still buzzing on the counter, relentless. By the time I looked, it showed 30 missed calls. I sat on the couch and let the glow from the candle fill the room. The silence felt full alive. I picked up the phone and listened to one more voicemail. Dad again. Hey Rachel, not sure if you're seeing these messages. The bank said they'll send someone out if we don't get this fixed. Please call us. Then another one. Mom, this time her voice brittle. Sweetheart, I know you're upset, but this is getting out of hand. Please, I'm begging you, call me. I turned the phone off and placed it beside me. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. I just felt still. When the soup was done, I sat at the table, spoon in hand, and ate slowly, the warmth grounding me. The quiet hum of the heater filled the background. My chest felt lighter, but there was a strange ache beneath it, a mix of peace and grief. Later, Julia called. I answered. You sound calm, she said immediately. I am, I replied. They've called about 30 times today. And you didn't pick up, no. I smiled faintly. And the world didn't end. That's the sound of boundaries, she said. I leaned back in the chair, letting her words settle. It's strange. I feel free, but I also feel cruel. You're not being cruel, Rach. You're being fair. They're just not used to fairness. I laughed quietly. That's a nice way to put it. After we hung up, I stood by the window, staring at the streaks of rain against the glass. My reflection looked softer, lighter somehow. I whispered, this is what freedom sounds like. When I turned the phone back on, it buzzed immediately. New messages, new voicemails. I ignored them and opened my email instead. A notification blinked at the top, automatic payment canceled. Then another late notice issued. I exhaled slowly. The house was officially no longer mine to carry. The next message was from Sophie. I can't register for next semester. The school says there's a hold. Please, just this once. I read it twice, then closed the app. Just this once had turned into years. By nightfall, the rain had stopped. I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, the candle still flickering beside me. The phone vibrated again on the table. Mom, Dad, Sophie, all names I loved. All people who had never really seen me. I watched the screen light up, then fade back to black. I thought about all the years I'd scrambled to fix things, the endless loop of saving them while losing myself. Every emergency had been another way to keep me tied to them. Now my silence had become their chaos. I took a deep breath and turned off the phone again. The sudden quiet was beautiful. I leaned back and closed my eyes. For years, I had been the first call they made when something broke. Tonight I wasn't answering. I wrote in my notebook before bed, the same phrase repeating itself across the page. Today was the first time I didn't pick up. It sounded like peace. When I finally lay down, the candlelight flickered against the ceiling. Outside, the world was silent except for the faint hiss of melting snow. The last thing I saw before drifting to sleep was the phone on the nightstand, screen dark, resting like a wound that no longer hurt. When I woke, the first thing I saw was the number on the screen, 43 missed calls. The phone lay on the nightstand, still vibrating faintly, as if exhausted from trying. My chest tightened, not from panic, but from recognition. The war had begun. I sat up slowly, the room still half dark, and scrolled through the list. Mom, Dad, Sophie, Mom again. The newest voicemail was from my father. The preview line read, "We need to talk. It's about the house." I pressed play. His voice was softer than I remembered, stripped of its usual calm. "Rachel, something's wrong with the mortgage account. The bank sent a letter. Please call me. Your mother's worried." A pause, then, "Just call us, okay?" The line ended, and for a long time I stared at the phone. I didn't cry. I didn't throw it. I just felt the same stillness I'd felt the day before, heavy but steady. For years, every emergency had been mine to solve. This time, I let the emergency exist without me. By the time I made coffee, an email pinged in my inbox. Bay State mortgage, late payment notice, escalation in progress. The message was sterile cold. I imagined my parents' faces when they opened their own copy of that email. Mom's lips tightening, Dad rubbing his forehead, pretending it would somehow sort itself out. I sipped my coffee and whispered, "You wanted simple, Mom." This is simple. Outside, the morning light had turned the snow to a thin layer of white sheen. I opened the window a crack. The air smelled clean, almost sharp. For a strange moment, I felt something close to peace. But peace never lasts long. My phone buzzed again, this time with another voicemail, Sophie. I pressed play. Her voice was unsteady, like someone trying not to cry. "Rach, I just got home and there's a paper nailed to the door. It says something about foreclosure. Mom's crying, Dad's freaking out. Please just call me. I don't understand what's happening." Her words twisted in my chest, but I didn't move. I set the phone down and stared at the steam rising from my mug. "I understand," I whispered. It was strange how quickly chaos spread when I removed my hands from their world. The house I had held up for years was finally showing its cracks, and for once I didn't have to repair them. By noon, the sun had come out. The world outside looked deceptively calm. Kids dragging sleds down the street, a mailman waving to a neighbor. I wondered if my parents' neighborhood looked the same, the calm surface hiding panic underneath. Another email arrived. Notice of property inspection scheduled. The words sat on the screen like a confession. I imagined my father answering the door to a man in a suit, clipboard in hand. My mother hovering behind him, cheeks flushed with humiliation. Maybe the neighbors had seen. Maybe they were already whispering. The thought didn't make me happy, but it didn't hurt either. It just felt inevitable. I spent the afternoon cleaning the kitchen, wiping counters that didn't need wiping, organizing cabinets I wouldn't open again. Each small action steadied me. When the phone buzzed again, I didn't look. I already knew what they'd say. The pattern never changed: fear, denial, blame, plea. Always in that order. At 4, another voicemail appeared, this one from an unfamiliar number. I pressed play and froze. "Rachel, dear, this is Mrs. Caldwell from your parents' neighborhood. I just wanted to say I'm so sorry about what's happening. Everyone's talking about that letter from the bank. I hope your parents are okay." Her voice was gentle, sympathetic, but my stomach turned. Everyone's talking, so the secret was out. The truth I'd carried alone for years had finally escaped into the world without my permission. I leaned against the counter, letting the weight of it settle. I used to wish people would know how much I'd done for them, how invisible I'd been. Now that they did, it didn't feel victorious. It just felt honest. As evening fell, I went for a walk. The air was cold but not cruel. I followed the path down to the river, my boots crunching against the gravel. The water was gray and slow, glinting with the reflection of streetlights. I sat on a bench and watched it move. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd find comfort in their downfall, I would have denied it. But this wasn't comfort, it was clarity. The house hadn't fallen apart because I stopped paying. It had been rotting long before my money just kept the walls upright. A memory surfaced me at 24, sitting at that same dining table with a stack of papers spread out, my parents watching me sign my name on the mortgage forms. Dad had said, "You're part of this house too." Mom had smiled like she was proud of me. Now 8 years later, I realized the truth. I hadn't been part of the house. I'd been the foundation. When I returned to the Airbnb, dusk had turned everything blue. The phone blinked with new messages, their glow soft against the dark room. I ignored them and lit the candle again. The scent of cedar filled the air, grounding me. I wrote in my notebook, "For years I was the secret holding the house together. Now the secret is out. Let them stand on their own truth." I closed the notebook and stared at the candle's flame, thinking about what Julia had said, "Silence isn't cruelty, it's a boundary." It was past 9 when my phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. I pressed play expecting anger. Instead, it was my mother's voice, thin and cracking. "Rachel," she began, her tone trembling. "The neighbors know. Mrs. Parker said people were asking at church. I can't show my face. Your father's barely speaking. Please call, please." I could hear her breathing hitch before she hung up. I sat back and let her voice fade. "You wanted easy," I said softly. "Now it's easier without me." For the rest of the night, I didn't check the phone again. I cooked dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and butter, and ate at the small kitchen table, the candle flickering beside me. The simplicity of it felt almost holy. Outside, the street was slick with melting snow reflecting the light from the window. I watched a man walk his dog, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Life kept moving. No one paused to see the invisible lines that had bound me to my family for years, now cut clean. When I finally crawled into bed, the phone buzzed one last time. Another voicemail, maybe, from Sophie this time. I didn't play it. I didn't need to. I knew the rhythm of desperation by heart. Instead, I reached for my notebook one more time and wrote, "When silence feels cruel, it means someone is finally hearing the truth." I underlined the sentence and closed the book. The heater hummed softly, the candle burned low. For the first time in a long time, I didn't dream about the house or the bills or the weight of keeping everyone safe. I dreamed of nothing at all, and it was beautiful. The voicemail came just after dawn. The light through the blinds was faint, barely touching the edge of the room when the phone began to buzz. I reached for it out of habit, then stopped myself. My thumb hovered above the screen before I pressed play. Mom's voice filled the silence, trembling but sharp. "Rachel, the bank sent someone to the door today. An inspector. Your father nearly had a heart attack. What's happening? Did you forget the payment? Please, honey, fix this." The call ended with the sound of her breathing, uneven, desperate. I set the phone down carefully and whispered, "For years you never asked if I was okay. Now you remember how to beg." The apartment was cold, the air still. I made coffee and sat by the window watching a thin mist curl over the street below. Every few minutes the phone buzzed again. I ignored it. The number of missed calls ticked upward like a countdown, but I didn't care. For once, I didn't feel panic. I felt distance, safe, solid distance. I pictured their house in Portland, the same white shutters I'd repainted for them 2 summers ago, The garden I'd paid to have landscaped the porch light that had been replaced twice. All of it now part of a house they could no longer afford. I had carried it for them, and now it was learning how to fall without me. By mid-morning, I opened my laptop and searched flights. Sedona, Arizona glowed on the travel site, red rocks, desert trails, and sunlight that seemed to burn the guilt out of you. My finger hovered over the book button. I hadn't taken a real break in years, not since before Dad's retirement. Maybe this was how I would breathe again. I clicked purchase before the fear could stop me. As the confirmation page loaded, another voicemail appeared. Sophie this time. I played it already, knowing what she'd say. Rach, I just talked to Mom. They're losing it. The inspector said something about an auction notice. You need to call them. You can't just ignore this. Her voice broke on the last word. Please, you're the only one who knows what to do. I closed my eyes, letting her voice fade. That's the problem, I whispered. I always knew what to do. I thought about calling her back, but my body refused. My hands stayed still, my jaw tight. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote across the top of a clean page. When you stop saving them, they finally see the cost. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, thin rays cutting across the kitchen table. I felt the warmth hit my hands and let it stay there, grounding me. Around noon, I packed my bag. Just the basics. A few clothes, my laptop, the black notebook. I folded the sweater Julia had given me last Christmas, the one she'd said made me look like peace trying to happen. As I zipped the suitcase, I remembered all the other holidays when I'd packed gifts into boxes for my family, not one of which had ever been returned. The phone rang again, the sound slicing through the calm. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the latest voicemail. Rachel, please, Mom said, her tone cracking. People are talking. The neighbors, the church, everyone knows. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? Her breath hitched. You've destroyed everything your father and I built. Please call back. We need to fix this together. Together. That word made me laugh out loud. I whispered to the empty room. Together was the illusion, Mom. You just never saw who was holding it up. In Portland, they were unraveling. In San Diego, I was finally still. By afternoon, Julia called. I answered immediately this time. Her voice was calm, steady like an anchor. Hey, I saw your message about taking a trip. You okay? I'm fine, I said. Better than fine, actually. They're falling apart, Julia. I stopped paying, and it's like their world is ending. Isn't it strange, she said softly. You've been the invisible wall holding everything together, and they never noticed it until it cracked. Now they're calling me cruel. Julia laughed, but there was no mockery in it. Silence feels cruel to people who only loved you for your noise. I leaned against the wall, the phone warm against my ear. I don't know what this is supposed to feel like. Freedom, guilt, justice, it's all tangled together. Maybe that's the point, she said. You don't have to choose anymore. When we hung up, I sat at the table for a long time, tracing the edge of my mug with one finger. The word she'd said, freedom, stayed with me like a spark under the skin. That evening, the phone buzzed again. I didn't even flinch this time. I listened to the hum of the heater and the faint sound of rain against the window. Outside, the streetlights had begun to flicker on their glow, stretching across the wet pavement. For the first time in weeks, I felt tired in a good way. Not the exhaustion of carrying everyone, but the calm fatigue that comes when you finally set something down. I packed the last of my things into the suitcase, zipped it shut, and wrote a small note to myself on a sticky pad. Gone for a while. Don't wait up. Before bed, I played one last voicemail. It was Dad this time. Hey kiddo, he said quietly. Your mom's really upset. The inspector's coming back tomorrow. I don't know what to do. We just need you home. The phrase hit me like an old bruise. We need you home. They never said that when I was wiring money, when I was paying the bills. They only remembered me when something broke. I whispered into the dark, you didn't need me home. You needed my wallet. The next morning, I was up before dawn. The suitcase waited by the door. I brewed one last cup of coffee, turned off the lights, and sat by the window as the first light bled into the sky. The phone vibrated one more time, a final message from Sophie. Mom says the bank's coming back. Everyone's blaming each other. I can't stop crying. I don't even know who we are anymore. I stared at the words on the screen for a long time before replying, maybe now you'll find out. Then I deleted the draft before sending it. Some messages didn't need to exist. At the airport, I turned my phone on airplane mode before takeoff. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the city shrank beneath the clouds. I pressed my forehead to the window and whispered, let them face the winter. I'm heading toward the Sunday. When I landed hours later, Sedona stretched below me in shades of red and gold. The air was dry, sharp, alive. I breathed it in like medicine. That night, as I lay in a small rental cabin surrounded by desert quiet, I scrolled through the last few voicemails I hadn't deleted. My parents' panic, my sister's confusion, my mother's fury. Each message sounded smaller than the one before, like the wind losing strength. I didn't listen to any of them again. I just pressed archive and let them vanish into digital silence. Outside, the stars were brighter than I'd seen in years. I stepped out onto the porch, the wood cool beneath my feet. The desert air wrapped around me, dry and soft. Somewhere far away, a coyote howled. I whispered to the dark, you always said it would be easier this way, Mom. You were right. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of my own breath, the quiet, steady, and strong. For the first time in my life, silence wasn't the absence of love, it was the proof of it. The desert air smelled like rain when I woke. Thin sunlight filtered through the blinds, spilling gold across the wooden floor. Outside, the rocks glowed red against a sky so wide it made me dizzy. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then, I saw my suitcase by the door, the black notebook on the table, and remembered I was far from home, exactly where I was supposed to be. I poured coffee into a chipped mug and stepped outside. The silence was complete, except for the distant cry of a bird somewhere over the canyon. I breathed in the stillness until my lungs hurt. It wasn't the silence of absence anymore. It was the silence of survival. My phone lay face down on the table behind me. I hadn't turned it on since landing. I wasn't sure I wanted to. Out here, time didn't move the same way. I felt like I'd stepped outside the noise into a world where no one could reach me with their needs or their guilt. After breakfast, I drove into town. The streets were narrow and quiet, lined with small galleries and cafes that smelled of coffee and desert clay. A woman at a pottery stall handed me a cup of lemonade and said, "You look like you're trying to remember how to breathe." I smiled because she wasn't wrong. I wandered through the market, touching woven blankets and painted stones until I stopped in front of a small postcard stand. The top row showed red canyons under a blazing sunset. The second row showed a quote written in cursive, "Sometimes you have to disappear to be seen." I bought that one. When I got back to the cabin, I sat at the table with the postcard in front of me and finally turned on my phone. The screen lit up with notifications that scrolled endlessly. 78 missed calls, 32 messages, 12 voicemails. The sight made my stomach tighten, but not with fear, just weariness. I pressed my thumb against the power button, but stopped. Maybe I needed to hear it, if only once. The first message was Mom. Her voice was thinner than before. "Rachel, the inspector came again. The neighbors saw. The church knows. I don't know what to do." Then she whispered, "Please just tell me what to say to them." The next was Dad. "Your mom's not sleeping. We might have to sell kiddo. The bank's being rough. You always had a plan, what should we do?" The third was Sophie, frantic. "Rach, I can't register for classes. My account's frozen. I didn't know you were paying. Mom said it's all your fault, but that doesn't make sense. Please just tell me what's happening." I let the messages play out, one after another, each one layering over the next like echoes of the same story: panic, confusion, fear. When they ended, I sat in silence, my hands trembling. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad. I just felt like I was listening to ghosts. They had spent years pretending everything was fine. Now they were being forced to live in the world I'd been carrying for them. It wasn't revenge, it was truth. I opened the notebook and wrote one sentence across a clean page. They're finally learning what easy costs. Outside, the wind rose, stirring the dust. I walked to the porch, phone still in hand. The desert stretched endlessly before me, vast, untamed, and indifferent. It reminded me of the ocean near home, except this silence didn't drown. It purified. By afternoon, the sun blazed high, and I drove toward the red cliffs. The road twisted upward until I reached a small overlook. I parked the car, stepped out, and leaned against the railing. Below me, the canyons unfolded in shades of rust and gold. The beauty of it made my chest ache. For the first time, I thought about my father's voice, not the desperate one from the voicemails, but the one from years ago, humming Christmas carols while fixing the porch light, calling me kiddo as though I'd never grow up. Somewhere between then and now, we'd lost the ability to talk without needing something from each other. Maybe this distance was the only way to remember who we'd been before obligation replaced love. The wind picked up, tugging at my hair. I took out my phone and scrolled through the messages again, stopping at Sophie's last one. I read it slowly. Please just tell me what's happening. I typed back a single sentence: I stopped paying because I couldn't afford to disappear anymore. Then I deleted it before sending. That night, I made dinner in the small kitchenette, scrambled eggs, toast, and half a bottle of wine I'd bought from the market. The air was warm, the kind of warmth that settles into your bones. I ate slowly, the candle flickering on the counter beside me. My phone buzzed again. I didn't even look. I thought about Mom's voice, brittle with embarrassment, about the neighbors gossiping about the whispers at church. They had always cared about appearances more than honesty. Now their image was cracking in public, and I wasn't the one holding the glue. When the candle burned low, I sat on the couch and opened the notebook again. Across the top of the page I wrote, I didn't ruin them. I stopped protecting the lie. The words steadied me. I let them sit there for a long time before I closed the cover. Later that night, I walked outside. The sky was ink dark, filled with stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. I lay down on the wooden porch and stared up until my eyes blurred. Somewhere far away, a train rumbled through the desert, its whistle low and lonely. I thought about calling Julia. I wanted to tell her I understood now, that silence didn't destroy things. It revealed what was already broken. Instead, I whispered into the empty air, I'm not coming back to fix this. The next morning, I woke to a single new voicemail. The preview said, from Sophie. I played it while the coffee brewed. Rach, she began, her voice quiet, hoarse from crying. Mom says the house might be listed next week. Dad's pretending he's fine, but he's not. I don't know what's real anymore. I didn't understand how much you did. I thought they were taking care of me. I'm sorry. She stopped there, no explanation, no excuses. Just, I'm sorry. I sat at the table for a long time, the cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. A part of me wanted to call her to tell her it was okay. Another part knew it wasn't my job to make it okay anymore. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote one more line beneath yesterday's words. Forgiveness doesn't mean rebuilding. Sometimes it just means resting. Outside, the sun rose higher, turning the red cliffs gold. The phone buzzed again, another voicemail, another plea, but I didn't press play. I poured the cold coffee down the sink, opened the door, and stepped out into the light. The air was sharp and clean. The world stretched out before me, endless and silent. I breathed deeply, feeling the weight I'd carried for years begin to dissolve. Behind me, the phone kept buzzing, insistent and small, its sound fading with every step I took toward the open desert. The wind woke me before sunrise, rattling the windows like a quiet warning. I rolled over, disoriented, the thin desert light stretching across the cabin floor. For a moment, I thought the noise was the phone again, that constant vibration that had haunted me for weeks. But when I looked, the screen was still dark. The silence was almost kind. I made coffee and stepped outside barefoot. The wood of the porch was cold, rough under my feet. The air smelled of rain and earth, the kind of scent that makes you feel small and clean. The canyon spread out before me, endless red and gold. I stood there holding the mug in both hands and whispered, I did the right thing. Saying it out loud didn't make it easier, but it felt like the truth. When I came back inside, I finally turned on my phone. The screen exploded with notifications, 93 missed calls, 14 new voicemails, messages from numbers I didn't even recognize. I felt my pulse quicken, not from panic, but from the weight of knowing exactly what waited in those recordings. Still, I pressed play. The first voice was Dad's. Rach, the inspector, came again. They said they'll change the locks if we don't settle by next week. I didn't realize your name was still on the papers. Please, can we talk? He sounded old. Older than he ever had before. The next was Mom. Your father's ashamed, Rachel. Do you understand what you've done to us? Everyone's whispering. Then a softer, broken tone. Just come home, sweetheart, please. Then Sophie's voice shaking. I can't focus on school. I had to move out of my dorm. I didn't know you were paying for everything. Why didn't you tell me? Each voice overlapped in my head, an orchestra of regret and panic. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I just sat on the couch, staring at the window, the sky beyond it turning pale and wide. They were finally saying what I'd waited years to hear, not love, not apology, but acknowledgement. The truth had made them small, and for the first time I didn't feel guilty for it. I walked to the table, opened my notebook, and wrote in calm, even strokes. They finally see the cost. The next few hours passed in a strange blur. I cleaned the dishes, refolded, my clothes, made more coffee. Every movement felt deliberate, like I was rehearsing a life that didn't revolve around anyone else's chaos. When the phone buzzed again, I ignored it. I poured another cup of coffee and went outside. The desert was quiet except for the hum of wind brushing against the rocks. I sat on the porch steps and let my body relax into the silence. For a moment, my mind drifted back to a night long ago, me at 16, sitting at our kitchen table while Dad muttered over a stack of bills. Mom had sighed. Don't worry, we always figure things out. I'd offered to get a part-time job and they'd smiled, calling me their responsible girl. That's when it began. The quiet contract that I'd carry them forever. Now, decades later, the contract was broken. I whispered to the wind. It wasn't love. It was labor. By late morning, another voicemail arrived. Sophie again. They're talking about selling the house, Rach. Mom says it's your fault. Dad won't even eat. I don't know what to do. Please call me. There was a pause, a shaky breath, then I know I took advantage. I didn't understand before. But I do now. Please don't let them lose everything. The apology hit harder than I expected. I pressed the phone to my chest and closed my eyes. For years I'd begged for someone in that family to understand what I carried. Now Sophie did. Too late, but still it was something. I saved her message instead of deleting it. I needed to move. I grabbed my coat and walked until the town's edge disappeared behind me. The trail wound through the rocks up to a ridge overlooking the canyon. The view stretched forever. No walls, no noise, no expectations. I sat on a flat boulder and let the wind whip my hair into my face. Should I call her? The question circled in my head like a fly that wouldn't land. Should I call any of them? I knew the answer already. If I called, I'd fix it again. And they'd forget again. The cycle would start over. I looked down at the cracked rock beneath me, the sunlight glowing through its fractures. It was still beautiful, maybe more so because it had broken. That was what I wanted for myself, to be whole without pretending. When I got back to the cabin, I checked my phone again. A new text blinked on the screen, Mom, then Dad, then one from a number I didn't know, probably a neighbor or a bank officer. I didn't open any of them. I scrolled past their names until I saw Julia's. I called her. Hey, Desert Ghost, she answered, her voice warm. How's it feel being unreachable? Strange, I said. Good strange. Did they stop calling? No, I just stopped listening. She was quiet for a beat. That's progress. I hesitated. They're losing the house. I figured, she said. How do you feel? I stared at the flickering candle on the table. Lighter and heavier at the same time. That's what truth feels like, Rach. Balance. We talked for a while about the cliffs, the stars, the way time moved slower out here. When I hung up, I felt steadier. That evening I cooked dinner, turned off the lights, and sat by the window watching the sun fall behind the rocks. The desert glowed like fire, then faded to deep violet. The phone buzzed again. A new voicemail. Dad this time. His voice cracked halfway through. We might lose it, kiddo. The bank's making decisions faster than we can keep up. I'm sorry for all of it. Your mom and I thought we were protecting you. We weren't. We were just too proud to ask for help the right way. I listened twice. The words didn't fix anything, but they were real. No excuses, no manipulation, just regret. It was the closest thing to closure I would ever get. I opened my notebook and wrote, "Forgiveness isn't a gift, it's a release." When the ink dried, I tore the page out and folded it neatly, slipping it inside the postcard I'd bought, the one that said, "Sometimes you have to disappear to be seen." I didn't know who I'd send it to, maybe no one, but it felt like the right place for the thought to live. Outside, the stars began to appear one by one. I turned off the lamp, letting the darkness fill the room. The phone sat on the table, quiet for once. Before bed, I listened to Sophie's message again, her voice breaking on the words, "I'm sorry, I didn't cry. I just whispered back, me too." Then I saved it again just to remind myself that understanding, even late, was still worth something. I lay down, the desert wind brushing against the cabin walls, and closed my eyes. For years, I'd measured love by what I gave. Now I was learning it could exist without sacrifice. Tomorrow the world would keep spinning, the bank would send another letter, my parents would scramble. But tonight, in this small cabin surrounded by open sky, I finally felt like the story wasn't about them anymore. It was about me learning to breathe in the quiet I'd once feared. The last thing I wrote before sleep took me was a single line in the notebook. Forgiveness means keeping the door open but never carrying them through it again. The message came just after dawn. The light in the cabin was soft blue-gray, the kind that makes everything feel like it's still dreaming. My phone buzzed once on the nightstand, and for a moment I thought about ignoring it. But when I saw the preview were selling the house, I knew the moment I'd been waiting for had finally arrived. I sat up slowly, pressing my palm to my chest, as if that would steady the rush of emotions inside me. The screen glowed in the dim light, one message from Dad, one from Sophie. I opened Dad's first. "We signed the papers yesterday," it said. "Your mother couldn't watch. The realtor's putting up the sign next week. I thought you should know." The next message was from Sophie. Shorter. "I want to understand." For a long time I just sat there staring at those 4 words. They didn't feel like an accusation. They felt like surrender. Outside, the desert was waking up, the sun creeping over the cliffs. I made coffee, poured it into the same chipped mug I'd been using all week, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, dry, heavy, with the scent of sage. Somewhere in the distance a bird cried out once, then stopped. "They finally did it," I whispered, watching the horizon shift from gold to white. They let it go. When I came back inside, I opened the black notebook again. On the last page I wrote, "The house was never mine. I just paid to keep their illusion alive." The words bled into the paper like ink trying to drown itself. A memory surfaced me at 24, standing on that porch, paintbrush in hand, my father beside me. He'd said, "One day this house will be yours too." I'd smiled, believing him. Back then I thought love meant proving yourself useful. Now, years later, I realized I'd been the scaffolding holding everything upright. Without me, the whole thing collapsed. The phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. I hesitated before pressing play. It was Mom. Her voice was small, tired, stripped of the polish she always used when pretending things were fine. "We spoke with the realtor today. The house goes on the market next week. I can't believe it's come to this. Your father's not sleeping. Sophie keeps crying. I don't know how to look at anyone at church. If you'd just called, maybe we could have fixed this. I closed my eyes, the mug still warm in my hand. I did call Mom, I said quietly. You just didn't hear me. The message ended with a sigh that sounded like surrender. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or guilt. I felt distance, the kind that brings peace instead of pain. Later that morning, I drove into town. The roads curved between red cliffs and desert brush sunlight, glinting off the hood of the car. Every mile felt like another piece of weight slipping off my shoulders. When I reached the small cafe near the market, I parked and went inside. The same barista from before greeted me with a smile. You're back, she said. Guess I am, I said, and ordered a coffee. At the next table, a family of 4 sat together laughing about something spilled on the floor. Their voices blended into the hum of the cafe, the kind of sound that once would have made me ache. Now it felt like background music to a life that wasn't mine anymore. When my coffee arrived, I pulled out my notebook and wrote on a napkin. They didn't lose the house because I stopped paying. They lost it because they forgot who built it. The words felt like a truth I'd been trying to say my whole life. By the time I left, the day had turned bright and clear. I drove back with the windows down, the wind tangling my hair. Around noon, another voicemail appeared. Sophie again. Her voice was different this time, shaky but honest. I didn't know, Rach. About the mortgage, the bills, any of it. I thought Mom and Dad had it handled. I used to think you were distant because you didn't care. Now I think you were just tired. I stopped walking, her voice playing softly in my hand. I was both, I whispered. She kept talking. I'm angry at them, for lying, for letting you carry it all. But I'm angry at you too because you never told me. I would have helped. I smiled faintly. You were a kid, I said, even though she couldn't hear me. The voicemail ended with a long silence before she added, I'm sorry. I sat down on the porch steps, staring out at the dust, swirling in the distance. Maybe this was what forgiveness sounded like. Not a confession, not a hug, but the quiet acceptance that we all failed each other somehow. That afternoon, I wrote one final note in my journal. Forgiveness isn't about mending. It's about release. When I looked up, the sky had shifted into the soft gold of late afternoon. I walked to the ridge beyond the cabin, where the canyon opened like a scar in the earth. The air shimmered with heat. I stood there, hands in my pockets, and imagined the house in Portland, the blue shutters, the yard I'd paid to maintain the rooms I hadn't seen in years. I pictured the realtor's sign in the yard, the neighbors whispering, Mom watching from behind the curtains, Dad standing by the door pretending not to care. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was losing something. I felt like I was being set free. By evening, the light turned copper and slow. I walked back to the cabin and poured myself a glass of water. My phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't from any of them, it was Julia. She didn't bother with small talk. You sound lighter, she said. They sold it, I replied. I figured. How does it feel? Strange, I said. But good strange, like watching a storm end after years of rain. Julia laughed softly. You know, sometimes peace feels like emptiness at first. That's how you know it's real. Her voice cracked a little when she said it, and I realized how long it had been since anyone had spoken to me without asking for something. Thanks for reminding me, I said. After we hung up, I stood at the window watching the last of the light fade over the desert. The candle I'd bought on my first night here sat on the table, burned nearly to the base. I lit it one last time. Its scent filled the room, cedar smoke, and something faintly sweet like the ghost of a forest. Before bed, I wrote a short message to Dad. I hope you find peace with the sale. Take care of each other. No signature, no explanation. Just that. I hit send and turned the phone face down. I walked outside barefoot, the air cooling against my skin. The sky was streaked with violet, the stars just beginning to appear. I looked up at them and whispered, It's yours again, all of it. When I went back inside, the phone buzzed once more, a new voicemail. I almost didn't check, but something in me needed to hear it. Dad's voice was soft, slower than I remembered. We sold it, Rachel. But we need to tell you something before it's gone. I listened to the message twice, the last words echoing in my head. We need to tell you something. I turned off the light, letting the candle burn low beside me. The room flickered with gold and shadow. Whatever came next, I wasn't afraid of it. Outside, the wind swept across the desert, carrying the last traces of daylight away. I closed my eyes and let it. The voicemail played 3 times before I finally sat down to listen. The words were quiet, almost broken. We sold it, Rachel. But we need to tell you something before it's gone. My father's voice, older, tired. I stared at the phone in my hand, unsure if I wanted to know what came next. For a moment I considered deleting it, pretending I hadn't heard it at all. But curiosity had a way of winning when love had already lost. I took a deep breath and called back. The line rang twice before he answered. Rachel? His voice cracked like he hadn't spoken in days. I got your message, I said, my tone flat but steady. What do you need to tell me? He hesitated, and I could hear the faint buzz of a television in the background, the sound of a motel air conditioner humming too loud. Your mom's here, he said. She wants to talk to you too. I almost ended the call, but then I heard her voice, soft, hesitant, not the polished tone she used when pretending everything was fine. Rachel, I know you don't owe us anything, but there's something you should know about the house. I stayed silent. The weight in her voice told me this was going to hurt. She exhaled shakily. Years ago, when your dad retired, we took out another mortgage. We didn't tell you. We used the money to keep things afloat. We thought we could handle it, but we couldn't. When you started helping with payments, it covered both loans. My heart didn't race. It just sank slow and heavy like a stone dropped in deep water. So all those years, I said, my voice calm, I wasn't saving you. I was paying for your mistake. Her silence was answer enough. Dad cleared his throat, the sound brittle. We didn't want to burden you. We were ashamed, Rach. You'd worked so hard. We thought if we told you, you'd hate us. I closed my eyes, pressing the heel of my hand to my forehead. You should have told me anyway, I said quietly. You made me think I was the reason you survived when I was just cleaning up your lie. I know, he whispered. We were wrong. The words were so small I almost missed them. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence on the line was thick, full of all the years we'd wasted pretending things were fine. Then my mother said I didn't know how to ask for help without feeling small. You always seemed so capable, Rachel. It made it easy to pretend we'd done something right. Her voice cracked on the last word. I closed my eyes again, and for a second I could almost see her standing in that kitchen with her perfect hair and her pressed cardigan, trying so hard to hold her pride together while everything else crumbled. You didn't lose the house because I stopped paying, I said softly. You lost it because you built it on pride. There was no reply. Just the faint sound of her crying, muffled but real. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to comfort her. I just let her cry. After a long pause, Dad spoke again. We're moving into a small rental outside Portland. It's nothing like before, but it's enough. Your mom says it feels temporary. I think it feels honest. Something in me loosened. Honest, I repeated. That's a good start. Maybe, he said quietly. Maybe it took losing everything to finally see what mattered. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to scream at them for letting me carry their shame for so long. But all I felt was exhaustion, and underneath it, a strange kind of understanding. They hadn't ruined me. They'd simply taught me what not to become. I hope you're both okay, I said finally. I really do. My mother's voice returned barely above a whisper. Rachel, do you hate us? I looked out the window. The desert sun was rising, gold spilling over the red cliffs, painting everything it touched in warmth. No, I said. But I don't need you to love me the way you did before either. I hung up before she could reply. The quiet afterward was absolute. I sat at the table, my hands folded in front of me, staring at the phone until the screen went dark. Then I opened the black notebook, flipped to a clean page, and wrote, Silence can hide lies, but it can also protect peace. The difference is who controls it. The act of writing the words felt final, like closing a door that had been left open for too long. Afterward, I drove out to a nearby overlook where the cliffs dropped away into a sea of color. The air was still except for the wind brushing through the brush. I sat on a rock, letting the warmth of the sun soak into my skin. The memory came uninvited, the Christmas potluck, the laughter, my mother's cardigan glowing in the firelight as she smiled like I'd never existed. That night used to hurt, now it just felt distant, like a story I'd outgrown. They excluded me because I reminded them of their debt, I whispered. Now my absence reminds them of the truth. I stayed there until the sun dipped low and the desert turned copper. When I got back to the cabin, I opened the notebook again. The pages were filled with years of math, mortgage totals, utility payments, tuition transfers, but the last few pages were different now. They weren't numbers anymore. They were sentences, choices, boundaries. I tore out one of the old pages, the one that listed every payment I'd made for them. The ink had faded a little from where my hand had smudged it over the years. I held it over the small fireplace, struck a match, and watched it burn. The paper curled at the edges, blackening, the numbers disappearing into flame. When it was gone, I whispered, "That house was built on my back. But this piece, this one's mine." For the first time, I believed it. That night, the sky was clear enough to see the Milky Way. I lay on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the hum of the desert. My phone lay beside me, silent. I didn't need it anymore. The stars above looked endless, cold, but alive. I thought about the conversation I'd just had and felt something unexpected. Not grief, not triumph, but gratitude. Losing them had given me myself back. I went inside and made tea. The kettle's whistle filled the small room, soft and steady. As I poured the water, the phone buzzed once more, a single message. "Sophie, did you talk to them?" I typed back yes. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I am," I wrote. Then, after a pause, she sent one last message. "What happens now?" I looked out at the desert through the kitchen window, the horizon still glowing faintly from the setting. Sunday, I typed slowly. Now, nothing. And that's the best part. I set the phone down, finished my tea, and blew out the candle on the table. The smoke rose in thin silver spirals, vanishing into the quiet. For the first time, I didn't feel like the daughter who'd been erased. I felt like the woman who had finally stopped disappearing. The morning light spilled across the room, in soft gold, stretching over my half-packed suitcase, and the notebook still open on the table. The desert outside was quiet, like it knew this was goodbye. I sat on the edge of the bed with my coffee, the mug warm in my hands, and stared at the page in front of me. It was filled with words I'd written over the past week. Small pieces of truth, the kind I used to swallow to keep the peace. I flipped back to the very first page where the list still sat: mortgage, utilities, prescriptions, tuition, a whole lifetime reduced to transactions. Then I turned to the last page, blank except for the date. The space between those two pages felt like the distance between who I'd been and who I was now. I took out a sheet of the thick paper I'd bought my first day in Sedona and began to write. Not to my parents, not to my sister, but to myself. You did not fail for walking away. You simply stopped mistaking sacrifice for love. You are allowed to choose peace over guilt and silence over noise. You don't owe them a home or an explanation. You owe yourself the life they never let you have. When I finished, I folded the letter and slipped it into the front pocket of my bag. I didn't know if I'd ever read it again, but it felt good to give my truth a place to live. Outside, the wind had already begun to stir, carrying the scent of sage and rain. I zipped my suitcase and took one last look around the cabin, the candle stub on the counter, the cup I'd bought at the thrift store, the way the morning sun painted everything in copper. This small, quiet place had become more home to me than the house I'd paid for all those years. At the airport, I didn't check my phone until I reached the gate. There was one message from Sophie. They moved into the rental. "Mom said the house feels strange without you. Dad asked if you're safe." I smiled, a soft ache forming in my chest. I typed back, I'm safe. I hope you are too. Then I turned the phone to airplane mode and slipped it into my coat pocket. As the plane lifted above the desert, I looked out the window and watched the land fall away in wide strokes of red and gold. It didn't feel like leaving. It felt like shedding. When I landed in San Diego, the sky was overcast, the air cool and heavy with salt. I picked up my bag and walked outside, the sound of the ocean faint in the distance. The city was alive again, cars rushing by, people hurrying with phones in hand, but I didn't feel pulled by it anymore. At home, the apartment greeted me with the same quiet it always had. The fake Christmas tree still stood in the corner, its lights dark but still intact. I set my suitcase down, unzipped it, and took out the letter. I laid it on the kitchen table beside my old notebook and whispered, I'm home. I made tea, lit the last cedar candle, and opened the window. The breeze carried the faint sound of waves from down the block. For a long time, I just stood there breathing it in. Then I unfolded the letter again, not the one to myself, but the one I'd started for them. It wasn't long, just a few lines. I hope you find peace. I hope you tell the truth. I hope next time the invitation comes before the apology. I folded it once and slipped it into an envelope addressed simply to my family. No address, no name. On my way to the beach, I dropped it into the nearest mailbox without looking back. The walk to the ocean was quiet. The air tasted of salt and memory. When I reached the sand, I took off my shoes and let the cold water brush over my feet. The horizon stretched endlessly gray, meeting gray, and I thought about the house one last time, the porch light I'd replaced, the walls I'd painted, the laughter that never included me. They could sell every brick of it and it still wouldn't touch the part of me that finally belonged to no one. It took losing everything they built to realize I had already built something stronger, a life that was mine. The sun began to sink behind the clouds, turning the water silver. I reached down, picked up a seashell, and held it to my ear. The sound of the ocean filled it, steady and endless, like a heartbeat that had been waiting for me to listen. I smiled and let it fall back into the surf. That evening, I sat by the window with the candle flickering beside me and opened my notebook one last time. The final page was blank. I picked up my pen and wrote, I am not erased. I underlined it twice, then closed the notebook and set it aside. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the dark water. My phone buzzed softly, a text from Julia. Welcome home. Freedom looks good on you. I smiled and typed back. It feels good too. The tea had gone cold, but I didn't mind. The warmth was coming from somewhere else now. I watched the candle burn low, its flames small but steady, and thought about all the times I'd tried to keep the light burning in other people's lives. Tonight, it was mine. I stood open the window wider and let the breeze carry through the room. The candle flickered its scent, filling the air one last time before I blew it out. Smoke curled upward like a quiet prayer, dissolving into the dark. For the first time in years, there was no heaviness in my chest. Just space. Just stillness. And now I want to ask you something. Have you ever been the one who carried everyone else until there was nothing left of you? Have you ever chosen silence, not because you gave up, but because you finally understood your worth? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear how you found your peace. And if my story reminded you of your own, stay with me for a while. There are more stories waiting here. Stories about family justice and the quiet strength that rises when we finally stop apologizing for existing. Because maybe the truth isn't loud or cruel. Maybe it sounds just like this, soft, steady, and finally your own.